Hi class, I hope you're doing well. This is a review video for chapters 6 and 7, which more so talks about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Before we kind of get into it, I really would advise that you download the PowerPoint so that you can make notes on your PowerPoint, and so that before you take your test, you review those notes, and so that you have a little bit more review material, something physical if you would like to print it out, if you're able to print it out or write it out as far as your own personal notes. But I do advise that you download the PowerPoint that is already on Blackboard and then use that to follow along with this video so that you can go ahead and make your own notes. And then also another thing, these two like photosynthesis and cellular respiration, you're going to see that there is some overlap. And some people would say that one is kind of the reverse of the other, and so we will talk more about that, but just kind of keep that in mind. You're going to see a lot of similarities, and so I would hate that you get mixed up between these two processes. So please advise to make sure to either print out or download the PowerPoint and then make your own notes. So let's talk about organisms that are able to actually photosynthesize. And so there's some pictures here of different types of organisms. So they vary from just a unicellular organism, like this is a diatom, which would be a protist, or even bacteria. So these are singular, right? This is one cell, so this is what we call unicellular. So this is a bacteria that is able to photosynthesize and is called cyanobacteria. Euglena also is unicellular, but then you also have bigger organisms like an actual plant. So a plant has a lot of cells. It's multicellular and it is able to photosynthesize. Same with moss. Moss is multicellular. And then over here, kelp is also multicellular. So keep that in mind that this is something that can be done by unicellular and multicellular organisms. They did have here like the other types of organisms that can. So we already mentioned plants are able to photosynthesize, algae and cyanobacteria. You might be confused with this one, the algae. So some algae is actually a plant, and then some algae is not. And there's a few distinctions. Like if it's unicellular, we don't consider that a plant. It's considered just algae, and then we would put it in the protist category. So algae can be a little bit confusing. So I just wanted to, I guess, emphasize that. So really what photosynthesis is that they're able to transform solar energy into chemical energy of carbs. So they're able to absorb the sun, right? Because the sun is the source of all energy. So they absorb the sun and they change that into chemical energy of carbs, which is that they change it into glucose. Let me go ahead and put that there, which is a sugar, right? That's why it says carbohydrate. So it turns it into a sugar. We also know that these things like plants are autotrophic, meaning that they make their own food, is how they say it. They make their own food. They're not able to move around and like, well, plants specifically. Plants are not able to get up and move around and eat like we can. So they have to make their own food, and this is how they do it. They make their own food through photosynthesis. And then here at the bottom it says producers feed themselves and all of the consumers. So this is like the kind of like the chain. At the bottom you have the producers, then consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary. That's what they're referring to. So when we talk about how they're able to actually absorb the light, these organisms have pigments, right? They have chlorophyll, and then we have them here. The chlorophyll, the types of chlorophyll, and also the carotenoids. So they have if they are, how do we word this? If they are able to get hit by a certain wavelength, they get what we call excited. That pigment will get excited, and then that is what fuels the process of photosynthesis. And so you can kind of see different pigments reach their peak at different wavelengths. And then they also characterize them by different colors. So like the carotenoids typically are going to be your, like the reds and yellow leaves, whereas the other ones will be like a green leaf plant. And then this visible light refers to what we can see. So we see typically between the 400 and 700 nanometer range. But wanted to throw this in just so that you're kind of aware about what that means as far as like pigments and stuff. So this chlorophyll, I'm sure you've heard of chlorophyll. That is an actual pigment, and that pigment is found in plants. So when we talk about the larger organisms, they have an actual chloroplast. Things like bacteria would not have a chloroplast. So a chloroplast is something that is specific to eukaryotic cells. So this would be like plants. Plants are eukaryotic because we know that they have a nucleus, and so they also have a chloroplast. And a chloroplast is a huge organelle. There's a picture of it here on the bottom right. So chloroplasts are really big, and that's where photosynthesis occurs. There's also different structures within the chloroplast. So right here we have the chloroplast. Inside you have the stroma, and so the stroma would be equivalent to the cytoplasm of the cell. It's kind of like a jelly. And then they have these thylakoids, which are these discs, and then a stack of these discs is what we call a grana. So that's just kind of the anatomy of a chloroplast. And they also have a what we call a double membrane. So these are the words that we were just mentioning. And it says chlorophyll and other pigments reside within the thylakoid membrane. So inside of the thylakoid is where you find these pigments, chlorophyll. So when the sun hits the plant, and then inside of the plant you'll find these chloroplasts. Inside of the thylakoid are the pigments, and so the pigments are the ones that get excited and they start the process of photosynthesis. So I think I'm looking for the actual equation of photosynthesis, and I don't see it yet. But it says that carbon dioxide will be reduced in the stroma into carbs. So carbon dioxide, as you may know, plants absorb our kind of like our waste. Like we exhale CO2, as well as other organisms, they exhale or let out CO2, and then the plant will take in that CO2, and it's reduced in the stroma, which is that jelly, to make carbs, which is the glucose like we mentioned earlier. So I'm going to put that again just so that we don't forget. And it says here that glucose is the chief organic energy source for most organisms. So, okay, let's go ahead and move on. There's two really big parts to photosynthesis. The first one is the light reactions, and the second is the Calvin cycle. So light reactions is like it sounds, it's light dependent, and this would be, I guess, light independent, right? It doesn't need the light. Okay. So light reactions does need light. Calvin cycle does not need light for it to occur. So during the light reactions, which happens in the thylakoid membrane, the pigments absorb the sunlight, which gets excited and it energizes the electrons. The water is oxidized, releasing electrons, hydrogen ions, and oxygen. And so the big thing that I really need you to remember from here is where it occurs, right? But also what is made. So here in the light reactions, ATP is made. This as well, the NAD gets reduced into NAD pH. NAD plus gets turned into NADPH. So I really need you to remember the products. And why is that? So this ATP that was made here is what fuels this process, right? So light reactions makes ATP and it makes NADPH, and those products are then fueling the Calvin cycle. So without these, the Calvin cycle cannot occur, right? So after it makes ATP and it makes NADPH, the Calvin cycle now can turn, right? It converts captured energy to chemical potential energy, and it can make you that glucose molecule, right, to produce a carbohydrate. So it happens in this order. It's light reactions, and I have a really good picture for you to look at here, right? So the light hits the pigments here, it gets excited, it produces NADPH, it produces ATP, which is energy. And so that is what fuels this process, right? And so at the end of this process, it makes a carbohydrate, which would be glucose. So just kind of remember that. This fuels this, and then this will make the carb, but it also will send these, like, you see how this is ATP when it uses it, and then it turns into ADP. So this is adenosine triphosphate. Once it uses the phosphate group, it turns into ADP. So it's this kind of recycling of products and reactants is what's occurring here. But just know that this fuels this, it makes glucose. And so just try to remember, I guess this slide, and also this slide also shows you where it's occurring, right? So here are the light reactions. It tells you it's in the thylakoid membrane, and then it tells you right here is the stroma. So the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma. So remember, this is a really good slide to probably study and just kind of maybe make a little flashcard out of that. So there are some plants that have adaptations because they live in extreme environments. And so this is a really good example of an adaptation. So this specific plant, right, you see a pineapple. Plants that grow in like arid conditions, arid means like it's really dry and there's probably not a lot of water. And so plants that live there cannot just be photosynthesizing in the same manner because they would lose a lot of water. So what these plants do, and we call these CAM plants, C-A-M, CAM plants. So CAM plants, what they do is that they only open their stomata when it's cooler. And I don't have a picture of a stomata, but you know what, let's do a Google search really quick. 1 second, right? Let's go ahead and look up. Give me 1 second. Stomata. Let's see what we can find. Right, let's see if you can see that. Okay. I guess this will work. Open image in new tab. Let's see. Okay, it's a little bit large, I know. So what you're looking at is the underside of a leaf. And so you can kind of see like the veins and everything. And so on the underside of the leaf, it has these holes, which are like, they're kind of like pores. Like imagine your skin, how your skin has pores. Leaves also have pores. And so this is where the plant is able to intake CO2, right? That's what we exhale. So we exhale CO2. This is where they're able to absorb CO2. And this is also the same place where they let out oxygen. So now that we know what the stomata is, let's minimize that. So for these plants that are in the desert, they keep that stomata closed so that they don't, they're not able to lose water through evaporation. And so they keep it closed, and then they only open it either at night or when it's cooler. And so it's an amazing adaptation that only these plants have. So again, these are CAM plants, and so they only open their stomatas at night. And so that's really it for photosynthesis. I really do advise that you kind of go back and review it as much as you can, because it can be a little bit confusing if you're not reviewing. So please make sure that you take some time to review before taking your exam. But let's go ahead and move on to cellular respiration. So photosynthesis is something that occurs in the chloroplast, although not all of them can, right? Because like we said, that bacteria don't have a chloroplast. So for them, you won't be tested on this, but just so that we can clarify. So for bacteria, they don't have a chloroplast. They will photosynthesize using their membrane as well as in their cytoplasm. They have kind of a special way of doing it. So they don't have an actual chloroplast, but they still can photosynthesize because they have photosynthetic pigments. But for the most part, if it is a eukaryotic cell, it does have a chloroplast, and that's the process that occurs with the light reactions in the Calvin cycle. For cellular respiration, this does not happen in the chloroplast. It happens in the mitochondria, and I know you all know the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and it's true, it's the powerhouse of the cell. It provides us with our ATP. So ATP is what we call usable energy. A cell cannot just, it can't just use glucose, right? Although glucose is a carb and it is energy, that's true. You cannot use glucose to fuel the cell because it's not small enough. So ATP is usable energy. So what if you have ATP, you can use that to fuel processes, right? So it says produces ATP molecules for energy. It requires oxygen and glucose. I'm gonna bold that. Requires oxygen and glucose, produces CO2 and water. And this is reasons you breathe. Essentially the reverse of photosynthesis. So like for us, right, this is a human. Everything that you eat needs to be turned into ATP. And then once it's turned into ATP, then your cells can use that energy. You know what, let me go ahead and talk about this really quick before I move on. So as you may have guessed, this is the mitochondria, and it has a similar structure to a chloroplast, right? Do you notice how there's two membranes? The same thing with the chloroplast. The chloroplast also has two membranes. This has what we call cristae. So cristae is it's like the folds. So wherever you see the membrane fold, that is what we would call a cristae. And the matrix is the in part. So this part that's purple, this is the most inner part of the mitochondria. And then again, the cristae are the folds, and then you have your two membranes. So, okay, let's go ahead and move on. These words will be on your exam, so please make sure that you remember them. And they're a little bit tricky. So redox reactions involves oxidation and reduction. So let's start with reduction first, because this is the one that's confusing. So when you see the word reduction, you think of less, but that's not the case for this definition. So when something is reduced, it adds hydrogen ions, or I'm sorry, hydrogen atoms, but this is specific to cellular respiration as far as hydrogen. So reduction is that you're adding, and then oxidation is going to be that you are removing. So please make a note of that. Removing and adding, they're the opposite. So just make sure that you practice that so that you don't miss it on your exam. So reducing is adding, and oxidation is removing. Okay, so for cellular respiration, there are three main processes that I need you to remember. I know here it says four, but the main ones that I really need you to remember are these three. So glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. Those are the three main parts of cellular respiration. And so this picture is great because it shows you where they are occurring. So if you notice, this is the mitochondria, and then there is one that is not happening in the mitochondria. It's this one, glycolysis. So glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. It does not happen in the actual mitochondria. Citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain do occur in the mitochondria. So this is a great reference for you to remember that. Another thing that you will see on your test is how much ATP each of these make. So let's go ahead and take a look. So glycolysis makes how much ATP? It makes 2. How much does the citric acid cycle make? It also makes 2 ATPs. And then the electron transport chain makes 34. So this one I'm going to make a note. Or I want you to make a note because I actually don't have anywhere to put it. So this could be a range. This typically could be like 32 to 36 ATP. It does depend. But if you see a number around 34, 36, 32, that's correct. But just kind of make a note of that just in case that it shows up. If it doesn't show 34 on your exam, then you would select the next one, either 32 or 36, and you'll still be okay. Okay, so this one says, outside of the mitochondria, so this is emphasis on glycolysis. And so I don't think it has it noted here, but do I want to mention yes, let's go ahead. Okay, so so bacteria is a prokaryotic cell. It does not have a mitochondria, but we have mentioned before that what is it that makes something considered to be living, right? What is that? And it's metabolism, that things can metabolize. And so metabolism is that it can make ATP. It can convert energy into ATP. And so not all cells have a mitochondria, right? So then how do they metabolize without a mitochondria? So what they do is just this process. They just have their cytoplasm and they're able to utilize glycolysis. So something like bacteria utilizes glycolysis and only makes 2 ATP, which you might think is really small, but you know what? Bacteria is also really small, and so that's the perfect amount, right? It's a small bacteria cell. It doesn't need a lot of ATP, so this is actually really sufficient. But when you're talking about something that is multicellular, like a human, like a cow, a dog, something that's really big and needs a lot of energy, then yes, using something like a mitochondria is going to give you a lot more ATP. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's how, um, why that is the way it is. But us as humans, we can actually do both. We can actually just do the glycolysis and get 2 ATP, or we can do the whole process and get 34. And I'll kind of explain when it is that we just do this as humans. But here it says that glycolysis for eukaryotes, right? So things that have a nucleus, it takes place in the cytoplasm and it makes pyruvate. And I have this bolded because this will be on your exam. So the product of glycolysis is, yes, the 2 ATP, but it also makes pyruvate, which then goes further and then gets continuously broken down. The next part in the citric acid cycle, it occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria, so the most like inner part. It happens in the most inner part of the mitochondria. It makes those 2 ATPs, and then these are the other processes that occur. But please make note of everything that I have highlighted and also bolded, because that will be probably 100% in your exam. In the electron transport chain, this is the one that we said makes the most ATP. It makes between like the 32 to 36 ATPs. It makes a lot. And so why is that? So it happens on the membrane, typically in the cristae part of the membrane where you have those folds. You're going to have these ions and electrons. If you were to follow the electrons, as they say, that's where you'll know is where all the ATP is being made. And so it happens in the cristae membrane, the inner membrane space. High energy electrons enter, low energy electrons leave. As pair of electrons pass from one carrier to the next, energy is released. It'll be captured for ATP production. The final electron acceptor is oxygen, which forms water. A little bit of water is formed at the end of cellular respiration, but I mean, it's very, very small. Okay, so this, I wanted to include this slide just because it kind of shows you how much ATP is made for each. So again, glycolysis is 2, the citric acid cycle is 2, the electron transport chain, it has this 30 or plus 4. So just remember this is a range, total ATP is going to be 38. But this is also something that I wanted to note, where is it, right here? That it says that it makes 36 to 38 ATP and about 40% of available energy in energy in a glucose molecule. That the rest is lost as heat. So when you are eating your food, you don't eat pure protein, or you don't eat pure carbs or fats and oils, right? You eat something that has all of that together. And so I wanted to include this just so that it's more beneficial to you as far as like you kind of knowing what's going on. So just know that your cells, they are able to break down proteins and use them for energy. Like I know the very popular keto diet where they just eat, what did they eat? I think they eat just proteins and fats, right? They actually just eliminate this. This is very strange. So they just eliminate the glucose and then they only use proteins and fats, and so their body will go into ketosis. So your body is actually able to convert these into ATP, but your body has evolved to really benefit from using the glucose. Your brain actually runs exclusively on glucose. So it's interesting that those people are doing that. I've seen that it's okay in like a short term kind of thing, but using it for like long term, and I mean like years, is probably something that we shouldn't be probably doing, because as you all know, like you should really things that are really good for you are things that are high fiber, and so fiber is something that you won't find in just like animal protein. Fiber comes from plants, so just make sure that you are eating your veggies. Is super important. Not only fiber, but the minerals and nutrients is something really, really important. And so I really hope that people get away from looking at food in just like these macromolecule or biomac. I think, what is it people say? Like, what are the macros, or looking at my macros? Or I'm not too familiar with that. But just try not to look at food in that way. Try to look for it as what I'm actually going to get from this food as far as nutrition, right? Minerals and nutrients, and not just am I getting protein and fats. So just wanted to throw that in just so that you kind of know that your body is actually able to do other things or use other things and use it as fuel. But the one that is the most developed as far as what you're evolved to be doing is this one, using carbs and turning that into ATP. This is also kind of sad, right? Extra food made into fat or storage. So whatever we eat in excess goes and is stored into fat. Okay, so if there is no oxygen present, instead of doing the glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain, it will skip the last two steps and it will just do glycolysis, and then it'll go into fermentation. And so let me go to this slide and then I'll go back. Right, so remember how we said that at the end of glycolysis it makes pyruvate? Okay, so if there is not any oxygen present, it's going to just do these processes where it's either going to make lactate or alcohol. So let's kind of go back really quick. It says bacteria uses fermentation to produce lactate or other organic acids, alcohol and carbon dioxide, and then yeast, which is like what they use for bread. Yeast, carbon dioxide makes bread rise, ethanol made into wine and beer. And so remember we mentioned in chapter 1, I believe, I'm not even sure if we covered this. I think we did, because we have mentioned cyanobacteria before, but in our earth, we did not always have oxygen. I know that's kind of crazy to believe. So like early earth, like the before plants, there was no oxygen. And so there was bacteria though. So bacteria did not have oxygen, but it was a cell and it was alive, so it had to metabolize. So it metabolized using this process, fermentation, where it doesn't need oxygen. So very interesting. This here on the right is something I would do with my students when we could see each other face to face. But so it's actually like yeast. So you put in yeast, you put in sugar and warm water, and then you put a balloon on top, and then probably about let 10 to 15 minutes go by, and then this balloon will start to blow up. And so this is not filled with oxygen, this is actually filled with CO2. And so that was kind of like why we did it, so that we can see that the gas is actually being let out from the reaction. And I think that's it. So thank you guys for your time. Please make sure that you do review this and send me a message on Pronto or email, however you need to. And I hope that you're super successful with your exam.